She knocked softly, a bowl of soup in her hands, and when I opened the door she whispered, "It's okay to miss him." I never knew those words, and the woman who spoke them, would change the way I carried my grief, and the way I saw love. I remember the sound of the knock more than anything else. Soft, hesitant, as though whoever stood outside didn't want to disturb me but couldn't stay away. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. The apartment was quiet, the kind of heavy silence that clung to the walls after someone you love is gone. I'd been living in that silence for weeks. But the knocking came again, and when I opened the door, there she was, my neighbor. She stood in the hallway light, her hair pulled back loosely, a simple cardigan wrapped around her shoulders. In her hands, she held a bowl of soup. Steam curled upward, carrying with it the comforting sense of rosemary and garlic, the kind of warmth I hadn't let myself taste in a long while. She didn't rush her words. Her eyes met mine, steady and gentle, as if she could see past my unshaven face and the shadows under my eyes. "It's okay to miss him," she whispered. For words, spoken so softly I almost doubted I heard them, yet they struck something inside me I'd been too afraid to touch. For weeks, I'd kept myself shut off, convincing myself I had to be strong, that grief should be silent. But her tone wasn't pitying, it was knowing. It carried a depth, as though she understood not just the pain of absence, but the quiet ache of trying to hold it all alone. I stood there, my hand still on the doorknob, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. The heat from the bowl radiated into my chest as she shifted it toward me, her fingers brushing mine as I took it. The touch was brief, accidental, but it startled me more than the words. Warmth against my skin after so long without it, so ordinary, and yet so deeply missed. Inside, I set the bowl down on the table, and when I glanced back, she was still at the doorway, not intruding, not stepping in uninvited. Just watching with that quiet steadiness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in months. My chest tightened, not only with the sting of loss but with something I couldn't quite name, a stirring I hadn't expected to feel when I looked at her. Maybe it was the kindness in her eyes, or the way her voice softened the edges of my grief. Whatever it was, I knew in that instant that her gesture was more than food. It was a hand reaching through the silence, offering me a reminder that even in loss, I wasn't invisible. She didn't leave right away. After I carried the bowl to the table, she stepped inside, closing the doors softly behind her as though she was afraid the world outside might intrude on the fragile moment that had just been created. There was no hesitation in her movements, yet she didn't push her presence on me either. She simply stood for a moment, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze drifting over the small, dimly lit apartment. "Do you mind if I sit?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, careful. I shook my head, and she settled into the chair across from me. The soup still steamed in the bowl between us, the fragrance rising like an invitation. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had shared a meal with me. Weeks of takeout containers and untouched leftovers had left the table bare of company. Now, across from me sat a woman who seemed to carry warmth just by being present. I lifted the spoon slowly, the metal clinking softly against the bowl. The sound seemed louder than it should have, echoing in the hush of the room. She didn't try to fill the silence with chatter. Instead, she sat with me, as if she understood that what I needed wasn't conversation, but simply not being alone. The first spoonful warmed my throat and chest. I hadn't expected it to taste like comfort, but it did. I lowered the spoon, staring into the broth, my thoughts drifting somewhere between memory and the present moment. When I glanced up, her eyes were on me. Not searching, not questioning, just meeting mine in a way that made me feel anchored. I looked away quickly, and she did the same, her lips pressing into the faintest of smiles. It was nothing dramatic, but the air between us shifted. At one point, as I leaned forward, the bowl wobbled on the uneven table. Before I could steady it, her hand reached out, her fingers brushing against mine as she caught the rim. The contact was so brief, so ordinary, yet it sent a current through me. Her skin was warm, her touch firm but gentle, and when she pulled back, I found myself wishing she hadn't. We returned to silence, but it was no longer heavy. It was a shared quiet, one where breathing felt easier, where the grief didn't feel quite as suffocating. She didn't need to say anything, and neither did I. The soup, the table, and her quiet presence filled more of the emptiness than words ever could. For the first time since the loss, I didn't feel completely alone at that table. And that realization was almost as healing as the meal itself. The first time she invited me outside, the late afternoon air still carried the warmth of summer, though the edges of the season were beginning to fray. She called across the narrow path that separated our apartments, asking if I wanted to sit for a while in her garden. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't used to saying yes to anyone anymore. But the look on her face was calm, unassuming, as though she would understand if I declined. That made it easier to nod and follow. Her garden was a patch of color and care tucked between two tired buildings. Potted plants lined the edges, and a low wooden bench rested beneath an overgrown vine. When I sat down, the wood felt rough against my palms, grounding me. She settled beside me, leaving a careful space between us, close enough to feel present, far enough to respect the wall I still carried. We watched the sky sink toward evening. The hum of cicadas filled the quiet, blending with the faint sound of a neighbor's radio drifting from somewhere down the block. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I could feel the weight of my own silence, but she didn't seem to mind. She looked straight ahead, her shoulders relaxed, her presence steady. Eventually, I found myself breaking the quiet. The nights feel heavier than the days, I admitted, surprised at my own honesty. My voice was low, almost swallowed by the sounds around us. She turned her head, her eyes soft. "That's when memories get louder," she said. There was no judgment in her tone, only understanding. I glanced at her, studying the curve of her profile against the fading light. There was something unguarded in the way she spoke, something that told me she wasn't offering sympathy from a distance. She had been here before, in her own way. When I asked, carefully, she nodded. "I've known heartbreak," she confessed. "Different from yours, but enough to know how silence can press on your chest." Her words lingered between us, weaving a thin thread of connection. I shifted slightly, my hand resting on the edge of the bench. She did the same, and for a moment, our knuckles almost touched. The space between our hands was so small, so charged, that I felt a pulse of awareness run through me. Neither of us moved closer, but neither pulled away either. We sat like that until the last of the sunlight faded, our quiet confessions resting in the space between us. The garden became a place not of distraction, but of fragile honesty. And for the first time in a long while, I felt less like a man lost in grief, and more like someone beginning to be found. It was one of those evenings when the sky lingered in shades of rose and gold, holding on to daylight a little longer than usual. I had just returned from the market, a paper bag tucked under my arm, when I saw her struggling with her own groceries at the bottom of the stairs. The handles of the bags cut into her wrists, and a laugh escaped her lips as a carton of milk nearly tipped sideways. "Here," I said quickly, crossing over before I could second-guess myself. She looked up, strands of hair falling loose from behind her ear, and for a moment I forgot what I meant to do. Then she smiled, relieved, warm, not embarrassed, and handed me one of the bags. Inside her kitchen, the light was soft, spilling golden across the countertops. She moved with quiet ease, setting items in their places, humming under her breath without realizing it. I helped where I could, feeling oddly at peace in the rhythm of it all. When she leaned over to place a basket of apples on the counter, a lock of hair slipped free, tumbling across her cheek. She blew at it lightly, but it clung stubbornly. Before I even thought, my hand reached out. My fingertips brushed her temple, sweeping the strand back behind her ear. The world seemed to pause. Her breath caught, not loud, not dramatic, but just enough for me to hear the shift. My fingers lingered a second longer than they should have against the curve of her skin, the warmth startling in its intimacy. Her lashes fluttered, and her eyes lifted to mine. It was only a heartbeat, a brief exchange, but it felt like the air had thickened between us. My chest tightened with the realization of what I had done. I drew my hand back too quickly, as if burned, fumbling for an excuse. "Sorry," I muttered, though my voice was unsteady. She shook her head, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "You don't need to be." Her tone was soft, but there was something in it, a trace of vulnerability, maybe, or gratitude, that made me swallow hard. The kitchen returned to its quiet rhythm, the rustle of bags, the clink of glass jars, but nothing was the same. The ghost of that touch lingered in my fingertips, and every glance she cast my way seemed to hold a weight it hadn't before. I left that evening carrying more than groceries. I carried the memory of her skin beneath my hand, and the unsettling warmth of knowing that for the first time, I wanted to reach for it again. The rain came suddenly that evening, sweeping across the street in heavy sheets, turning the world into blurred silver. I had stepped outside to clear my head, but within minutes I was soaked through. Before I could retreat, her door opened, and she leaned against the frame, holding out a towel with a knowing smile. "Come inside," she said simply. There was no hesitation in her voice, though I felt plenty of it in my own chest. Her kitchen was warm, the lamplight glowing softly against the storm's restless tapping on the windows. I dried my hair clumsily, trying not to leave puddles on her floor. She moved easily through the space, setting a kettle on the stove, her movements unhurried, as though the storm wasn't just outside but was something she'd learned to live with. When she set a mug of tea in front of me, I noticed how close she sat, shoulder to shoulder at the small table. The warmth of her presence felt as steadying as the cup between my palms. For a long moment, we both just listened to the rain, the steady drum against the glass filling the silence. It was I who broke it. My words slipped out before I could stop them, quiet and almost ashamed. "Do you ever wonder what people would say?" She tilted her head, her brows drawing slightly together. "About what?" I swallowed, staring down at the swirl of steam rising from my tea. "About someone like you, and someone like me." The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. When I dared to look up, her eyes were steady, though something shadowed them. She let out a slow breath, a faint smile touching her lips, though it didn't quite reach her gaze. "People will always talk," she said. "But what they say isn't always the truth." Our knees brushed beneath the table then, an accident I could have pulled away from, but I didn't. Neither did she. The small contact felt louder than any word spoken. Inside me, a conflict churned. I admired her, longed for her nearness, yet a voice in my head whispered that I was too young, that she was too wise, too experienced, too far ahead of me in life. She deserved someone who could match her certainty, not someone still learning how to carry his own grief. Yet when I glanced at her again, I saw something vulnerable in her expression, as if she carried doubts of her own. And the truth struck me, maybe it wasn't about who was older or younger, but about whether two people could meet each other in the same fragile place. The rain beat harder on the glass, and still, neither of us pulled our knees away. The evening I found her standing by the window, the world outside was washed in silver. Moonlight spilled across the floorboards, soft and steady, painting her figure in a glow that made her seem both fragile and impossibly strong. She didn't notice me at first, her arms were folded loosely, her gaze fixed far beyond the glass, as though she was looking for something she had lost long ago. I hesitated in the doorway, uncertain if I was intruding on something private. But then she spoke, her voice quiet, more to herself than to me. "I've spent so many years keeping people at a distance," she said. "Afraid they'd see me as foolish if I admitted I still wanted more." Her words sank into me, stirring something I had tried to keep buried. I stepped closer, my footsteps careful on the wooden floor. She turned her head then, and in the glow of the moonlight, I saw a rawness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. She wasn't the composed neighbor with her soft smiles and steady gestures, she was a woman standing bare in her own vulnerability. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "You don't look foolish," I said, my voice unsteady but honest. "You look human. And maybe braver than anyone I've ever met." For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the silence thick and charged. I wanted to say more, to tell her how much her presence had steadied me, how she had become the anchor I hadn't known I needed. But the words tangled in my chest, heavy with fear of saying too much. Instead, I let myself move slowly, carefully. I reached for her hand. My palm brushed against hers, tentative at first, as though I might break the moment if I pressed too hard. She glanced down, and then, without hesitation, her fingers slipped between mine. The contact was simple, yet it felt monumental. Her hand was warm, her grip gentle but sure, and in that quiet exchange I felt everything I had been holding back, my grief, my longing, the fragile hope of something new. Her breath caught, and she tilted her head just enough for our eyes to meet again. Whatever I hadn't spoken aloud, she seemed to understand. The air between us thickened, heavy with unspoken confession, with a longing neither of us dared name. We stood like that, hands entwined beneath the moonlight, the world beyond the glass forgotten. And for the first time, it didn't feel wrong to want something more, it felt inevitable. The days that followed carried a new kind of stillness, lighter, softer than the silence that used to haunt my apartment. It wasn't that grief had vanished, it still lingered in the corners of my mind, like a shadow that refused to fully leave. But now there was something else woven into the quiet, the memory of her hand in mine, and the unspoken truth we had both acknowledged that night. One evening, she called out as I passed her garden. The sky was painted in shades of pale gold and lavender, the last of the sun melting into the horizon. "Sit with me?" she asked. There was no hesitation in her tone this time, only a gentle certainty, as though she already knew I would say yes. I joined her on the old wooden bench, the same place where we had first spoken honestly. This time, though, there was no careful space left between us. She shifted closer, her shoulder brushing mine, her presence steady and natural. The air smelled faintly of earth and roses, and the world seemed slower here, as though it had chosen to grant us this quiet reprieve. For a while, we didn't speak. The cicadas hummed in the background, and the faint rustle of leaves carried with the evening breeze. Then, slowly, she leaned her head against my shoulder. The movement was so gentle I almost thought she was testing the moment, waiting to see if I would move away. But I didn't. Instead, I let my arm curve around her, resting against her back in a way that felt protective without needing to prove anything. She exhaled softly, her breath warm against the fabric of my shirt. That simple sound, the release of something she'd been holding, filled me with a kind of peace I hadn't known I was searching for. We sat like that, our bodies fitting together in quiet ease, as though the hesitations of the past had been softened by time and trust. I didn't need to tell her how much she meant to me, and she didn't need to remind me that it was okay to still miss the person I had lost. Both truths could live side by side, grief and the fragile beginnings of something new. As the sky deepened into night, I realized I wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. Her presence didn't erase the ache, but it made it bearable. And in that moment, with her head against my shoulder and my arm around her, the future felt less uncertain. Not perfect, not promised, but quietly hopeful. And that was enough.